This podcast is brought to you by AutoVision and its new AI assistant, Avery. Avery delivers data-driven appraisals, pricing, and detailed strategies for every vehicle. Visit autovision.com to learn more about Avery, where precision meets profit.
Welcome to Daily Drive for Monday, May 12th, 2025. I'm Jake Neer in Detroit, in for Jamie Butters, who's on assignment.
And I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, the U.S. and China agree to slash tariffs for 90 days. Mazda holds off on its earnings forecast as it braces for a U.S. sales decline. And Nissan dials up global job cuts to 20,000. Plus, Automotive News staff reporters Larry Valquette and Lindsay Van Hully join the show to talk about what's at stake for automakers and dealers in California and other states that have adopted strict vehicle emissions rules.
In a state like Vermont, they're talking about a monster hit that they're going to take.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry.
The U.S. and China are temporarily easing tariffs on products from each country. It's a dramatic ratcheting down of trade tensions, and it buys the world's two largest economies 3 months to work toward a broader agreement. The combined 145% U.S. levies on most Chinese imports will be reduced to 30% by May 14th. The 125% Chinese duties on U.S. goods will drop to 10%. That's according to a joint statement and from officials in a briefing today in Geneva. It's not clear what impact the 90-day truce will have on auto imports and exports between the two countries. The U.S. has effectively locked out Chinese-made EVs with steep tariffs, while China bumped up extra tariffs on U.S.-made vehicles in April.
Meanwhile, in Japan, import-dependent Mazda is bracing for a possible U.S. sales decline amid the tariff uncertainty. The automaker is withholding earnings forecast for the current fiscal year after booking a 26% drop in operating profit. CEO Masahiro Moro says Mazda needs more time to assess the impact of U.S. tariffs and customer acceptance of sales price changes before it can give a clear outlook. Mazda's U.S. sales rose 13% this year through April to almost 150,000. While U.S. sales are at risk of slipping into reverse, Morrow says the company will try to keep worldwide sales in line with last year's results by dialing up deliveries to other markets. Mazda will also grapple with the 25% U.S. tariffs imposed by the Trump administration by shifting its mix toward fast turnover models and scaling back incentives as market prices rise.
Fellow Japanese automaker Nissan plans to cut about 20,000 jobs globally. It's part of a ramped-up restructuring campaign under new CEO Ivan Espinosa. Japanese media report that the new plan calls for more than 10,000 personnel cuts, on top of some 9,000 already planned as part of the embattled Japanese carmakers' revival plan. Those reports come from Japanese broadcaster NHK and the Nikkei Business Daily. A Nissan spokesperson declined to comment on the reports.
Ford's plans to cut jobs overseas is prompting workers to walk off the job. Employees at the automaker's two plants in Cologne, Germany, plan to go on strike Wednesday. Ford said in November last year it would cut around 14% of its European workforce, mostly in Germany and Britain. It blamed losses due to weak demand for electric vehicles and poor government support for the shift to the new technology. The company declined to comment, citing ongoing negotiations with trade unions. Union IG Metall did not immediately respond to a request for comment from Bloomberg News.
And General Motors has hired automated driving pioneer Sterling Anderson as Executive Vice President of Global Product and Chief Product Officer. Anderson most recently co-founded and served as Chief Product Officer at Aurora Innovation, a self-driving truck startup that commercially launched driverless trucks on public roads last month. Previously, he led design and development of Tesla's Model X and Autopilot driver assistance system. Now he will help GM refashion itself for an era in which software rules the vehicle experience. Both Anderson and GM confirmed the move today. Anderson will report to company president Mark Royce and oversee end-to-end product lifecycle for both gasoline-powered and electric vehicles, including hardware, software, services, and user experiences. And those are today's headlines.
Coming up, reporters Larry Velquette and Lindsay Van Hully join the show to talk about the uncertainty surrounding California's emissions waiver. That's next on Daily Drive.
Just when you think you've priced a vehicle perfectly to sell fast, the market changes and potential profit slips through your fingers. After all the work of scouring auction sites, tracking competitor rates, and analyzing market trends, the loss of time and money leaves you frustrated. Meet Avery, your AI assistant from AutoVision. Avery revolutionizes how you acquire, price, and sell vehicles by analyzing every detail, from retail values to market trends. And the best part? Avery doesn't just give you numbers, it explains every recommendation so you know everything that was factored in. Picture this: faster appraisals, smarter stocking decisions, and more profitable sales, all without the exhausting legwork. With Avery, you don't just stay competitive, you lead the pack. Ready to see Avery in action? Visit autovision.com.
Welcome back to Daily Drive. I'm Jake Neer with Kellen Walker. California's Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule sets ambitious zero-emissions vehicle sales mandates and threatens stiff penalties for noncompliance. The rule requires an increasing percentage of new vehicles to be zero-emission until reaching 100% in the 2035 model year. Now, automakers and dealers in California, Washington, D.C., and 11 other states that have adopted the rule face a daunting challenge. Reporters Larry Velquette and Lindsay Van Hully contributed stories to a series in this week's edition of Automotive News about the mandates. They spoke with Jamie about what they could mean for the industry and what's at stake as the political environment changes rapidly here in the U.S.
Larry Velquette and Lindsay Van Hully, welcome back to Daily Drive.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie.
Larry, let me start with you. What's the big problem with the Advanced Clean Car 2 regulations?
On its face, when it was passed in 2022, nothing, right? It was back in those halcyon days when we were going to fill the world with EVs. It was an aggressive mark to hit, 35% by model year 2026, which is this fall. The problem is that, well, the last 2 years happened and EV growth slowed down. And now that 35% looks pretty unreachable. And as we head into this fall, we are now seeing automakers who are already dealing with tariffs, right? Automakers start to look at that and think, how are we going to meet this in these states, in these ZEV states?
Yeah, so we're like 8% EVs nationwide, and we have a number of states that are supposed to sell 35% EVs. That does seem like quite a mismatch. So what are automakers going to do? How are they planning to find a way to live with this?
Well, so we've got 5 states that will, plus California, that will join this fall, right? That's the West Coast, which is California, Oregon, Washington. And then we've got 3 on the East Coast, which is New York State, Vermont, and Massachusetts. So what they're going to do is they're going to mess with allocation. It's going to be much more difficult to buy anything but a EV or a plug-in at the very best in those states. And that means, because there's only going to be so many of them, that it's going to be more difficult to buy those vehicles if you're outside of those states. And the inverse is true. In those states, make it much harder to buy internal combustion vehicles, hybrids. And outside of those states, it's going to be easier to do that.
So, I mean, in California, it'd still be almost 2/3 of the vehicles would be gas burning, or at least hybrids, non-EVs and plug-ins. Is that not an adequate amount to judge? Or, I mean, I get it that like almost all the EVs are going to have to go to these CARB states. Yeah.
Yeah. And the penalties are really where the rubber meets the road here, because you're talking about penalties of $20,000 per non-compliant vehicle sold, right? So that are outside of that percentage. So if I sell 100 cars and, 25 of them are EVs, I still face $200,000 in penalties because the other 10 were not.
Most of these automakers sell more than 100 cars.
Yes.
in California, for instance.
In California. Yeah. And the thing is, California right now leads the nation in EV penetrations, about 20%, right? They still have a way to go to hit 35%. But you look in the Northeast, in a state like Vermont, and we talked to some dealers there, and I'll get to them in a moment. In a state like Vermont, it's 8%, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about a monster hit that they're going to take. And these dealers, and we interviewed them, they're worried about what this allocation is going to do to their business. Specifically, we talked to Toyota, White River Toyota, which is in White River Junction, Vermont, right on the New Hampshire border. They believe that if it goes through, this 35% mandate, if it goes through untouched, right now, they're going to go from a 1,300 new vehicle a year store down to sub 500.
Significant. And what are dealers going to do about it? They're just going to shrink to match the EV volume of what they can sell?
Well, they would rather not do that. My colleague, Lindsay Van Hully, has talked to a bunch of dealers and automakers that are going to their state capitals to try and get their states to adopt something a little more reasonable.
So, Lindsay, are they making any progress in any of those states?
It's early, I think. What we've seen so far is a number of state dealership associations in the states that have followed California's standard, talking about this really being their top policy priority. Tariffs have come in, that's obviously up there, but this is one of, if not the top policy priorities for some of these state dealership associations, because for a lot of the reasons that Larry talked about. There have been dealers who have actually been in meetings with legislators in state capitals to talk about this, to try and make the case. When I've talked with them, they said, we're really trying to explain, that model year 2026 is now. It's this summer, it's this fall. This is happening. And so the first state that has done any kind of action right now is Maryland. Back in April, the governor signed an order that delayed enforcement for 2 model years. They were going to be starting in model year 2027. There's a few states, Larry mentioned the ones that start this year, for the 2027 model year: Colorado, New Mexico, Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, the District of Columbia are all set to follow. And Maryland was set to be part of that 2027 bunch, but the governor pushed back enforcement implementation for a couple of years. And so other states are having meetings. They're trying to talk with governors' offices and legislators to really try and explain what's happening, to see if there's any kind of action, whether it's opting out altogether or just kind of slowing down that enforcement, kind of similar to what Maryland has done.
It's interesting that Maryland moved when they're not even the ones that are facing it this calendar year.
Yeah, and they've talked about this idea of just, we need a delay, right? And the fact is, in a state like Maryland, I think they said EVs accounted for about 12% of new vehicle sales in the first quarter of this year. And it's a state where, a smaller state, but there's a lot of kind of multi-family housing, and charging at home has been kind of a challenge. And the way that some of these states have talked about it is, if we get that time, we can sort of rethink how the standards should be set. What is a realistic trajectory based on where current consumer demand is? And that would also give us time to see what happens with the administration around EV purchase credits. If those go away, that's going to potentially impact demand in a negative way. What happens with tailpipe rules, and what kind of runway does that give to internal combustion engines? And all of these sorts of things that are still sort of uncertain would give time to let some of that play out, and also to give states the opportunity to look at what that might look like.
Well, what about California specifically? I mean, like Larry said, they're about 20%. I think I saw 22%. It's still a long way from 35. It was really I think a lot of us remember sort of the iconic press conference with Governor Gavin Newsom, signing the proclamation or declaration that there would be this 100% EVs and by 2035. California seems like it's going to be a stretch for them to even meet these goals, and it's the most EV advanced market in the U.S.
I talked to Brian Moss of the California New Car Dealers Association, and he told me effectively no manufacturers our dealers represent are going to meet the mandate for 26, even in California. And so what the association has done in conjunction with other business groups across the state really launched a public affairs campaign. And what they're trying to do is really get the California Air Resources Board, which is the regulator that implements this regulation, to slow down, to take a pause. They've called it to sort of recalibrate what that looks like. And, his point was California's made incredible progress, but it's not 35%. And so how do we look at that? His point was, we don't have control over what happens in Washington. We don't have control over what happens in the courts if there's any kind of challenge to this. But the regulator is in the state. They've adopted the regulation. They can act to slow it down if they choose.
So has the governor or the Air Resources Board shown any inclination to want to, recalibrate?
At this point, when we reached out to them, they told us, that there's flexibility that has been built into the rules. Automakers have the ability to purchase credits. There's additional time to be able to make up any shortfall in a given year in future years. And so they've indicated very much a willingness to work with manufacturers, basically to help it be successful. Can we find ways to extend flexibility to companies as needed? They've said no automaker so far has indicated that they won't be able to meet that target. And so that's kind of where they are right now. And I think there's a lot that's still to be determined on kind of what ultimately happens both in California and in the other states, as well as in Washington.
Let me add to Lindsay's point here because it's really important. That first, the penalties, those $20,000 a car penalties, right? That's in each state. So you're 12% short in California, then you got to make up 12%. You got to write a check for that 12% or buy credits. If you're 30% short in Vermont, you got to write a check or buy credits for that. So it's each state that will enforce this. And we're talking about some huge numbers here. Mm-hmm. You're asking the legislators to turn away revenue that would come from automakers, right? I just want to point that out.
Or the automakers, in order to not face the penalties, they deliver a very small number of gas-powered vehicles,
right?
Which
they reduce the denominator,
and then you would have a lot fewer vehicles getting sales tax paid on them,
yes.
and no penalties at all.
Yeah. The other thing that's really important here is that, which Toyota, Tom Stricker from Toyota pointed out to us, you really have to think about it. So Tesla is the big elephant in the room when it comes to selling credits, right? They've made a living out of selling credits. If the threshold is 35%, that means that everything that Tesla sells above 35% of its sales, they get a credit for, and they can sell those. But as this standard goes up every year, and it goes up 8%, so those states that are coming in a year from now, they'll be at 43%, right? And then 51% the following year. But that means that Tesla's credits shrink. So you have all these automakers who are going to want to buy more credits, and those that have credits to sell are going to have less to sell.
Percentage-wise, I guess it depends how fast they can grow. I mean, Rivian and Lucid are still startups, and Rivian is close to launching a more mass market type vehicle. I mean, they could have more to sell even as the percentage shrinks. But yes, the pie gets cut slimmer and slimmer.
And there's a lot of hungry mouths to feed off of that single pie.
So we're almost out of time, but I do want to make sure we touch on, there are some efforts in Washington. The House has moved to eliminate the California rules. So that's complicated because the parliamentarian says that the Congressional Review Act, it's the mechanism they're trying to use, is inappropriate, non-constitutional way to address the EPA waiver for California. Lindsay, is there any sense of where that's going to go, or what happens next there?
Well, it's up to the Senate whether to follow the House. And if they did, that would be unprecedented. And so it's difficult to know how that's going to ultimately work out. There are other avenues to re-examine this. I think there has been, what we do know is there's been an interest expressed at the presidential administration to revisit that waiver that California has. And they have it because they have to address, the unique issues that they have in their state to regulate their own vehicle emissions. And that's been in place for decades. And so the California Air Resources Board has talked about, planning to defend that ability. And that's something that they've done before. It's something that, certainly is still on the table. And what we don't know is just the timeline, the mechanism, and any kind of challenge to that, what that means for the rule in both California and in all of these other states.
Lindsay Van Holy, Larry Veliquette, thank you so much for joining me on Daily Drive today.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Jake Neer, in for Jamie Butters.
And I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to automotive news journalists Hans Greimel and Pete Bigelow for their reporting for today's podcast. You can get the latest news on emissions regulations, tariffs, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoyed the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.